When the last prayer was spoken, Cole Murdoch hadn't told a soul the truth in 23 years. So, when the senator's wife placed desert roses on his grave, followed by a confession that would shatter everything, he faced a choice that would either damn or redeem every soul in Two Trees. The devil's own wind was howling through the cemetery that day, carrying whispers of the dead and promises of secrets finally ready to be told. Only 3 living souls stood witness as they lowered Cole Murdoch into the unforgiving earth: Senator Wayland Stoddard, his wife May, and a young newspaper man whose curiosity burned hotter than the desert sun. "Senator," the reporter pressed, sweat beading on his pale forehead, "forgive my boldness, but the whole territory's wondering. Why would the great Wayland Stoddard, hero of Two Trees, the man who shot Liberty Valance himself, take precious time from his governor's campaign to attend the funeral of a nobody? A broken-down ranch hand who died forgotten and alone." Wayland's weathered hands trembled as he gripped his hat. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper against the wind. "Cole Murdoch was my friend." "But surely there's more to it than that, sir? I mean, you're the most famous man in the territory, and he was just the man who made me who I am," Wayland said, his eyes never leaving the grave. "The man who saved my life, destroyed my pride, and gave me everything I ever wanted." The reporter's pencil scratched frantically across his notepad, sensing the story of a lifetime hiding just beneath the surface. But he had no idea that what would happen next would turn everything the territory believed about heroes and legends into dust. As the gravediggers began their grim work, May Stoddard stepped forward with a small bouquet of desert roses, the same wild flowers that bloomed blood red in the harshest corners of the territory. Her hands shook as she placed them on the fresh earth, and when she spoke, her words carried the weight of 23 years of buried truth. "These were always his favorite," she whispered. "He used to bring them to me when we were young, before everything changed." Wayland felt his heart stop. He'd never known about the flowers, never suspected the depth of what had been hidden from him all these years. The desert wind seemed to carry the ghosts of the past, and suddenly he was no longer a distinguished senator, but a broken, beaten man crawling through hell itself. What happened next would resurrect ghosts that should have stayed buried forever. 23 years earlier, the Butterfield stage had been carrying more than passengers and mail when Liberty Valance and his devils struck like lightning from a clear sky. Among the victims was a young lawyer named Wayland Stoddard, fresh from Harvard and full of Eastern ideas about justice and civilization. They'd left him for the buzzards after taking his money, his dignity, and damn near his life. The desert was already cooking him alive when salvation came in the form of a tall, lean cowboy with eyes like storm clouds and hands gentle as a woman's touch. Cole Murdoch had been tracking strays when he found the half-dead stranger, and something in the broken man's face had stirred his soul. "Easy now, Pilgrim," Cole had said, his voice rough from years of desert wind and hard living. "You're safe now. The angels ain't ready for you yet." But Cole had no way of knowing he'd just rescued a man whose heart had turned to poison, whose soul was already being consumed by a demon called revenge. Wayland had recovered in Cole's one-room cabin, nursed back to health with beans and bacon, and the quiet companionship of a man who understood that sometimes words were just noise. But while his body healed, his spirit had been transforming into something dark and terrible. "I'm going to kill him," Wayland had announced one evening as they sat watching the sun die behind the mountains. I'm going to find Liberty Valance and put him in the ground." Cole had studied him with those storm cloud eyes. "You ever killed a man before, Pilgrim?" "Number, but I'll learn." "Killing's easy," Cole said quietly. "Living with it afterward, that's the hard part." But Wayland's mind was already made up. He'd thanked Cole for his kindness, borrowed a horse, and ridden toward the town of Two Trees with nothing but hatred to keep him warm. Two Trees squatted in the desert like a collection of sun-bleached bones, its single street lined with the Longhorn Saloon, Murphy's General Store, and a handful of other establishments that served the cowboys, drifters, and dreamers who dared to call the territory home. It was the kind of place where a man could reinvent himself, or destroy himself trying. Wayland took the lowest job he could find, swamper at the Longhorn Saloon. Every morning before dawn, he'd mop the floors, empty the spittoons, and endure the sneers and contempt of men who saw him as nothing more than a soft-handed Eastern fool playing at being a cowboy. They called him Pilgrim, and worse, spat tobacco juice at his feet, and made jokes about his soft hands and educated speech. But Wayland endured it all with a strange, cold smile that never quite reached his eyes. Every insult, every humiliation, was fuel for the fire burning in his belly. What they didn't know was that every night, when the town slept and the coyotes sang their lonesome songs, Wayland would slip away into the desert with the Colt .45 he'd bought from Murphy's store. He'd practice drawing and shooting until his fingers bled and his shoulder ached, until the gun felt like an extension of his very soul. The soft Eastern lawyer was dying, and something harder, more dangerous, was being born in his place. But it was an angel-faced woman named May Donovan who would truly change everything. May worked at the Longhorn, serving whiskey and dodging grabby hands with the weary grace of a woman who'd learned to survive in a world that showed no mercy to the gentle. She had corn silk hair and eyes the color of prairie sky. And she moved through the saloon like a ghost trying not to be noticed. "You're different from the others," she told Wayland one evening as she cleaned tables after closing. "You got book learning, don't you?" Wayland looked up from his mop, surprised by the kindness in her voice. Most folks in Two Trees treated him like something they'd scrape off their boots. "Some," he admitted. May's face flushed pink as desert dawn. Would you maybe teach me to read? I can pay you. I got some money saved up." "I'd be honored," Wayland said, and meant it. "And I wouldn't take a penny for it." What happened next would change not just their lives, but the soul of Two Trees itself. The lessons began in secret, in the back room of the saloon, after the last drunk had been sent home. May proved to be hungry for learning, her mind soaking up knowledge like desert earth, soaking up rain after a long drought. As she learned her letters, then words, then whole sentences, something beautiful began to bloom in the harsh landscape of Two Trees. One evening, as the desert sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, May finished her lesson and walked outside to find Cole sitting on the porch steps, his guitar cradled in his weathered hands. His voice, rough and gentle at the same time, carried across the quiet street.
Stars above the desert floor, tell me what you're shining for. Is it for the love I've lost, or the dream that ain't worth the cost? Ooh, stars above the desert floor,
paused in the doorway, her heart catching at the lonesome beauty of the melody. When he finished, she stepped forward. "That's beautiful, Cole. Did you write it yourself?" He looked up, a flush creeping across his sun-darkened cheeks. Just something that comes to mind when the night gets too quiet. He set the guitar aside and stood. "Didn't mean to disturb your studies." "You didn't disturb anything." May's voice was soft. "You sing it often." Cole shrugged, looking out at the desert where the first stars were beginning to appear. When a man's got more thoughts than words, sometimes a song's the only way to let them out. Soon, other folks began asking for lessons. Cowboys who wanted to write letters home to sweethearts they'd left behind. Children whose parents had dreams of something better than scratching out a living in the desert. Even some of the saloon girls who saw education as their ticket to a different kind of life. Before long, Two Trees had its first school, with Waylon as its teacher. The town began to change, civilization creeping in like morning light over the mountains. There was talk of bringing in a real preacher, maybe even a doctor. Hope, that rarest of commodities in the territory, began to take root. But not everyone was happy about the changes. And watching it all with the quiet intensity of a man who'd lost something precious was Cole Murdoch. Cole had been courting May in his own shy way for months before the pilgrim arrived. He'd bring her wildflowers and small gifts carved from desert wood, hoping she'd see past his rough exterior to the man underneath. But May's eyes had turned toward the man who'd opened the world of words to her, and Cole found himself on the outside looking in. "You're making a mistake," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch of the boarding house where she lived. The desert stars wheeled overhead like scattered diamonds, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. "Am I?" May asked, though her voice was gentle. She'd never wanted to hurt this good man who'd shown her nothing but kindness. "He's not what he seems," Cole said. "There's something dark in him, something that's going to bring trouble to all of us." May turned to study his face in the moonlight. Maybe. But maybe that's what this place needs. Someone willing to fight for what's right. Cole's jaw tightened. He'd seen enough of the world to know that fighting for what's right and seeking revenge were two different things entirely. But he also knew that arguing with May would only push her further away. What he didn't know was that the devil himself was already riding toward Two Trees, drawn by stories of prosperity and the Eastern fool who thought he could tame the wild country. The news came on a Tuesday morning in early spring, carried by a rider whose horse was lathered with sweat and whose face was pale as death itself. "Liberty, Valance is coming!" he shouted as he reined up in front of the saloon. "He's burned out the Morrison place, killed their stock, and scattered their bones. Says he's coming to clean out this nest of Bible thumpers and school teachers." The town erupted in panic. Women gathered their children and began packing. Men checked their weapons and planned their escape routes. The more prudent citizens were already hitching up their wagons, ready to flee before the storm hit. But Waylon Stoddard just smiled that cold, terrible smile and continued teaching his arithmetic lesson to a classroom full of trembling children. "Class dismissed," he said quietly. "Go home to your families. Tell them not to worry. Everything's going to be just fine." As the children filed out, May approached his desk. Her face was white as bone, her hands shaking like leaves in a storm. "Waylon, you have to leave," she whispered. "You know what he'll do to you if he finds you here. What he'll do to all of us." "I'm not going anywhere." Wayland said, his voice steady as stone. This is my home now. These are my people. But you could die. We all die, May. The question is whether we die for something worthwhile. He stood and took her hands in his. I love you. I should have said it sooner. But I love you more than life itself. And I'll be damned if I let that animal hurt you or anyone else in this town. That evening, as the sun painted the sky the color of fresh blood, Liberty Valance rode into Two Trees. He was everything the stories said and worse, a man whose very presence seemed to poison the air around him. Tall and broad-shouldered, with black hair and eyes like chips of obsidian, he sat his horse like a conquering king surveying his domain. Behind him rode 3 of his men, all of them armed and dangerous, all of them eager for the violence that was sure to come. Their horses' hooves struck the dust like the drumbeat of approaching doom. Valance's voice carried across the empty street like the tolling of a funeral bell. I hear there's a school teacher in this town, someone who thinks he can bring civilization to God's country. Well, I got news for him. There ain't no civilization west of the Mississippi, and there ain't gonna be as long as I'm breathing. The saloon doors swung open, and Wayland stepped out into the street. He'd traded his work clothes for a black suit and string tie, and the Colt .45 hung at his hip like a promise of violence to come. You looking for me, Valance? The outlaw's eyes narrowed as he studied the man in the street. Recognition dawned slowly, like a horrible sunrise. Well, I'll be damned and sent to hell, he said, his voice filled with cruel delight. If it ain't the pilgrim I left for dead in the desert. You're harder to kill than a desert rattler, ain't you, boy? Hard to kill and impossible to forget, Wayland replied. You took something from me, Valance. Tonight, I'm taking it back. Valance threw back his head and laughed, a sound like breaking glass and screaming wind. Boy, you got more sand than sense, but sand won't save you from what's coming. The 2 men faced each other in the dusty street, separated by 20 paces and a lifetime of hatred. The town watched from behind shuttered windows and locked doors, scarcely daring to breathe. Even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath. Whenever you're ready, Pilgrim, Valance said, his hand hovering over his gun, like a vulture waiting for death. Wayland nodded, his face calm as still water. I've been ready for this moment since the day you left me to die. What happened next would create a legend that would outlive them all, but the truth would be known to only one man. The seconds stretched like hours. A tumbleweed rolled across the street between them, driven by the desert wind. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed the hour, and a coyote called to its mate. Then, with a movement faster than thought, both men drew. The sound of gunfire shattered the evening air. 2 shots so close together they seemed like one. Smoke drifted between the combatants like morning mist, and for a moment, the world stood still. Liberty Valance stood for a heartbeat, his gun still in his hand, a look of surprise on his face. Then his knees buckled, and he toppled forward, dead before he hit the ground. Wayland stood over the body, his smoking gun still in his hand, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. The town erupted in cheers, people pouring out of buildings to celebrate the death of the most feared outlaw in the territory. The Pilgrim done it, someone shouted. He killed Liberty Valance. But what they didn't see was the figure crouched behind a water trough 30 yards away, a rifle still warm in his hands. Cole Murdoch had watched the whole thing unfold, had seen Wayland's shot go wide, had seen the look of terror on the pilgrim's face as he realized his moment of revenge had turned to dust. And in that instant, Cole had made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He'd pulled the trigger, sending Liberty Valance to whatever hell awaited him, and he'd let another man take the credit. The legend of the man who shot Liberty Valance was born in that moment, built on a foundation of lies and watered with the blood of a secret that would never be told. What happened next would turn that lie into a curse that would follow them all to their graves. The years that followed brought prosperity to Two Trees and fame to Wayland Stoddard. He married May in a ceremony that was talked about for years, became the town's first elected judge, and eventually won a seat in the territorial legislature. His reputation as the man who'd brought law and order to the wild country opened doors that had been forever closed to him back east. But with each success, each newspaper article that praised his courage, each speech that celebrated his heroism, the weight of the lie grew heavier. And always, always, Cole Murdoch was there to remind him of the truth. Not with words. Cole was a man of few words, but with his presence. He'd appear at political rallies, standing at the back of the crowd with his arms folded and his eyes fixed on Wayland. He'd be there at social gatherings, quiet and unassuming, but impossible to ignore. He'd tip his hat to May on the street, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes holding secrets that made her look away. Why does he do it? May asked her husband one evening after yet another uncomfortable encounter with Cole. Why does he follow us around like a lost soul? Wayland couldn't tell her the truth, that Cole's presence was both a torment and a necessity, the only thing that kept him tethered to reality. Instead, he said, some men never learn to let go of the past. But May was no fool. She'd seen the way Cole looked at her, the way he'd always looked at her, and she understood at least part of the truth. What she didn't understand was why he'd never fought for her, why he'd simply stepped aside and let Wayland claim the prize. The answer to that question would come only at the end, when secrets could no longer be kept, and the truth demanded its due. The political career that had been built on the legend of Liberty Valance continued to flourish. Wayland served 2 terms as territorial senator, championing causes of education and law enforcement. He was being mentioned as a serious candidate for governor when the telegram arrived, delivered by a boy whose face was pale with the weight of bad news. Cole Murdoch dying, consumption, asks for you, come quickly. Wayland found his old friend in a small cabin outside of town, wasted by the disease that had been eating at him for months. Cole's face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, but his voice was still strong when he spoke. Figured it was time, he said without preamble. Time to tell you the truth about some things. Cole, you don't have to. May's campaign troubles, Cole interrupted, his voice matter of fact. The stories about her not being able to read, about her working in the saloon, the whispers that nearly cost you the election. You think they just appeared out of thin air? Wayland felt the blood drain from his face. What are you saying? I spread those stories, Cole said. Made sure they got to the right ears at the right time. Knew it would make you fight harder to defend her, to prove you were worthy of her love. Why? The word came out as a whisper, barely audible above the desert wind rattling the cabin walls. Cole's eyes found his, and for the first time in 23 years, Wayland saw past the mask to the man underneath, the man who'd been carrying a burden heavier than any secret. Because I loved her, Cole said simply. Because I loved her more than my own life, and I knew that meant she needed to be with you, not me. I loved her from the first moment I saw her, Cole continued, his voice growing weaker, but his resolve stronger. But I also knew I wasn't good enough for her. You were educated, refined, everything she deserved. All I could do was make sure you became the man she needed you to be. Even if it meant living a lie? Even then. Cole's eyes were burning with fever, but his voice was steady. You think I cared about credit? About glory? About having my name in the history books? I cared about one thing, her happiness. And you made her happy. Waylon felt tears he hadn't shed in decades burning behind his eyes. I'm sorry, Cole. God help me. I'm sorry for everything. Don't be sorry, Cole said. Be worthy of what you've been given. Be the man she thinks you are, even if you know you're not. He died that night, peacefully, with May holding one hand and Waylon holding the other. His last words were a whisper meant for May alone. Take care of him. He's going to need you now more than ever. What happened next would finally bring the truth full circle and reveal the deepest secret of all. The funeral was sparsely attended. Just the two of them, the preacher and the young reporter who'd sensed there was more to the story than met the eye. As they walked away from the grave, May stopped and turned back. From her reticule, she pulled out a small bouquet of desert roses, the same wildflowers that had bloomed in the harshest corners of the territory for time immemorial. I picked these this morning, she said, her voice thick with emotion. They were his favorite. She placed them gently on the fresh grave, and as she did, the words came tumbling out like water from a burst dam. I can still hear you singing that old song about the stars, wondering what they shine for. Now I know. They were shining for moments like this, when the truth finally finds its way home. Then she whispered, I knew. Dear God, I always knew. Knew what? Waylon asked, though part of him already understood. About the shooting. About what really happened that night 23 years ago. She turned to face him, tears streaming down her face like desert rain. I saw Cole with the rifle. I saw him throw it in the old well behind the saloon. I knew he was the one who killed Liberty Valance. Waylon felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Why didn't you say anything? Because I also knew why he did it. Because he loved me enough to let me believe I was married to a hero. Because he loved you enough to let you become one. She touched his face gently. And because I loved both of you enough to let the lie stand. They stood there in the desert cemetery, surrounded by the vast emptiness of the territory. And for the first time in 23 years, Waylon Stoddard felt the weight of the lie lift from his shoulders. The secret that had built his career, that had made him a legend, had finally been revealed for what it was. Not a betrayal, but a gift from a man who'd loved without expectation, who'd sacrificed without recognition, who died without ever claiming credit for the heroism he'd shown. What do we do now? May asked. Waylon looked at his wife, this woman who'd stood by him through everything, who'd known the truth and loved him anyway. Then he looked at the grave where Cole Murdoch lay, finally at peace. We live, he said simply. We live, and we remember, and we try to be worthy of what we've been given. What happened next would ensure that some truths are meant to be buried with the dead. The reporter was still scribbling in his notebook as they walked back to their carriage. "Senator, surely there's more to this story. Some reason why you take time from your campaign to—" "Young man," Wayland said, helping May into the carriage, "some stories are meant to be buried with the dead. Some truths are too heavy for the living to bear." As they drove away from the cemetery, the desert wind scattered the roses across Cole's grave, carrying their sweet scent across the vast emptiness of the territory. And somewhere in that wind, if you listened with your heart instead of your ears, you could almost hear the echo of a truth that would never be told. The truth about the real hero of Two Trees, the man who'd shot Liberty Valance and asked for nothing in return but the happiness of the woman he loved. The legend would endure, passed down through generations of storytellers and historians, growing larger with each telling. But the truth would remain buried with Cole Murdoch, in a lonely grave outside a town that had grown from dust and dreams, watered by the blood of good men and women who dared to believe that civilization could bloom even in the hardest ground. And perhaps that was as it should be. Perhaps the truth was less important than the hope the legend inspired, the belief that ordinary people could become extraordinary when the moment demanded it. Perhaps Cole Murdoch had understood that from the beginning, and had chosen to let another man carry the burden of heroism while he carried the heavier burden of silence. In the end, the man who shot Liberty Valance was not the man history would remember, but he was the man who'd made that history possible, the man who'd sacrificed everything for love, the man who'd understood that sometimes the greatest heroism lies not in taking credit, but in giving it away. The desert wind blew on, carrying dust and dreams across the territory, and the legend lived on, built on a foundation of love and sacrifice and the kind of quiet heroism that asks for no recognition and expects no reward. And in the cemetery, outside Two Trees, desert roses bloomed on a grave that would never be visited by historians or celebrated by storytellers, but which held the remains of the truest hero the territory had ever known. The man who shot Liberty Valance was dead. Long live the man who shot Liberty Valance.